We looked at it as if it were out of Siberia. It was very strange. There was nothing but a lot of sand, sagebrush, but there was a GI vehicle, and we got in still wondering where we were and why we were there.
Scientific and military personnel arrived from all over America, many traveling under assumed names. A station master in Princeton, New Jersey, was baffled at the sudden demand for one-way tickets to the tiny station outside Santa Fe.
It was a little bit awe-inspiring to be in the middle of nowhere like this and not knowing what we were getting into, not the slightest idea.
Next stop for newly arrived personnel was an inconspicuous building in Santa Fe. Dorothy McKibben was in charge of the tiny office.
Santa Fe was full of young FBI agents, middle-aged agents, and to some of us, they were quite discernible because they were so well-dressed.
What did they do?
They wore gray slacks and tweed jackets and shirt with necktie, and they leaned against the walls of buildings, and they hung around La Fonda and the Capitol Pharmacy and all restaurants.
We drove through Santa Fe and then a place called Espanola, and then hit some dips in the road, and then started to climb. And I had never been in mountainous country. It was very interesting.
I had just finished reading The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, and of course, to go to this mysterious mountain on the top of which there would be a secret laboratory in which we would go into, the doors would slam, and a few years later, why, we would come out bearing an atomic bomb.
Very impressive, strange scenery, mountains, rocks, the desert. We crossed Rio Grande and arrived in a place full of little, well, how to call it, almost huts.
Oppenheimer had brought scientists and their families fresh from distinguished campuses all over the country. Ivied halls, soaring campaniles, vaulted chapels. Los Alamos was a boom town. Hastily constructed wooden buildings, dirt streets, coal stoves, and only 5 bathtubs.
There were no sidewalks, the streets were all dirt. The water situation was always bad.
One young physicist was Robert Crone.
It was not at all unusual to open your faucet and have worms come out.
Everybody was wearing Western clothes, jeans, boots, parkas. There was a feeling of mountain resort in addition to army camp. And the mixture was unbelievable. Then there was the awful mud.
The physicist Edward Teller had brought a piano and played Beethoven late into the night. From his cramped quarters in a 4-family dwelling, he could disturb more Nobel laureates at once than he could have anywhere else in the world. Oppenheimer had gathered the elite in physics, mathematics, and chemistry to build the atomic bomb.
I don't believe there was ever before an assembly of so many first-rate people for one task.
They in turn recruited their best students, promising kids working side by side with Nobel laureates.
There was no class distinction between the small fry and the big shots.
When I first came to the United States, I got to know a lot of the young people who had been at Los Alamos. Most of them were very young. They'd just gone right into it without even finishing their scientific training. And for them, it was just the most marvelous time of their lives.
People worked hard. Scientists worked around the clock, and the people made up for the lack of big city life, and there was a lot of partying.
We were very young, and it was just like a camp out.
Liquor was short in the area, so in order to spice up the parties, we used lab alcohol. Lab alcohol is 200 proof, basically, which is just exactly what you're looking for punch.
If you were in a large hall and you saw several groups of people, the largest groups would be hovering around Oppenheimer. He was great at a party, and women simply loved him and still do.
I found it extremely dashing in a sort of elegant way.
It was, for these young people, not only a great experience, it was also fun. It was a lark.
Yes, it was a good time. It was a good time in America. It was a good time to be American. It was a time when the whole country was pulling together in a cause which even now I think was just. That is, the idea that the Nazis would, Nazi Germany would win that war could have led to, it seemed to me, 1,000 years of dark ages, and everything that we meant by civilization could have come to an end. That's what it seemed to me was what the fight was about, or something pretty close to that, and most Americans felt that, and most Americans were in it just as hard as they could be.
Their average age was 29, and their job was to construct a mechanism which would trigger in a millionth of a second a violent chain reaction. They had 2 dance bands, a soda fountain, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, a radio station with no call letters, a cyclotron, and 7,000 fire extinguishers.
Somehow Oppenheimer put this thing together. He was the conductor of the orchestra or whatever it was. Somehow he created this fantastic esprit. No matter who you talk to, they all lived it, and they all, I think, almost without exception, felt it most strongly that without him this wouldn't have happened, it couldn't have happened.
Oppenheimer had envisioned a small community of 30 scientists and their families, but by 1944 he was in charge of a walled city of 6,000. The cost escalated to $56 million. 7 divisions: theoretical physics, experimental physics, ordnance, explosives, bomb physics, chemistry, and metallurgy.
He knew and understood everything that went on in the laboratory, whether it was chemistry or theoretical physics or machine shop. He could keep it all in his head and coordinate it. It was clear, also at Los Alamos, that he was intellectually superior to us.
The most striking contradiction is the fact that this man, who was so unworldly, so unpolitical in his youth, such a great scholar, so fond of metaphysical poetry, should suddenly emerge as the great administrator who put Los Alamos together and produced the atomic bomb.
I saw him change from that almost irresponsible intellectual, bohemian
and radical
person that he was, that I had known at Berkeley, to someone who was just completely dedicated to getting on with the war.
I think it was a real stroke of genius on part of General Groves, who was not generally considered to be a genius, to have appointed him. It was a most improbable appointment. I was astonished.
The professor and the general made an unlikely team. When Groves took charge of the Manhattan Project in 1942, there was barely enough plutonium in the world to cover the head of a pin, and very little uranium-235. These were the only elements that could fuel the Los Alamos bomb. To produce U-235, Groves built a secret 44-acre building in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In Hanford, Washington, giant reactors labored to produce a few pounds of plutonium. It was the most expensive scientific project in the history of the world. General Groves distrusted liberals, and yet in spite of Oppenheimer's well-documented leftist background, Groves overruled the astonished security officers who tried to block Oppenheimer's clearance.
He had arguments with General Groves, but I think they were mostly about sort of trivial things, like the fact that people were having too many babies, and he couldn't do anything about that. And when things came up that were really important, I think General Groves usually supported him.
He had to support Robert himself against the intelligence people who, of course, well, in fact, I not only wouldn't have cleared Robert, I obviously wouldn't have cleared 3/4 of the people on the at the place. So
why not?
Well, I mean, they were all